After being shaken by a loud bang emanating from the nearby woods, Kevin embarks on a quest to uncover the source. What he finds shocks him: a huge, unexplained rocket that had recently descended from the sky. As if this wasn't strange enough, he finds something else inside it, something far more momentous than the rocket itself. Kevin had stumbled upon a discovery that would change the world forever. On top of the giant rocket, Kevin had discovered a small hatch that he figured he might fit through. He debated going in as it could be dangerous. This was, after all, a rocket that fell from the sky mysteriously. Kevin knew that going inside is potentially dangerous, even life-threatening, but his curiosity quickly got the better of him. He decided to go inside the rocket. The rocket alone was probably worth millions, so there must be something even more valuable inside. The door slammed open after breaking free from the lock. He was becoming increasingly preoccupied with his curiosity, and all he could think about was what was inside the rocket ship. As he approached, he felt the heat of the rocket emanate from the hull. There seemed to be a hatch that he could open. He pulls off his hoodie and wraps it around the handles, and he opened the hatch. What he saw shook him to the core. Kevin couldn't believe what he was seeing and was unsure what he should do next. He had never imagined himself in this situation. But what did Kevin discover in the massive rocket? How did Kevin find the rocket, and why was it even here? When a small town in rural Alaska was jolted awake one night by a loud explosion coming from deep in the forest, people were curious but too afraid to go and investigate. All except Kevin, who was determined to discover the source. Kevin was one of the small town's heroes, a regular jock who was quarterback of the home team, grizzled man of the outdoors, a guy everyone could depend on. He saw this as a challenge only he could accomplish. Kevin was smart. Despite being knocked many times over during his years of playing high school football, he was aware that going out into the forest alone at this time of year was risky. There was a whole host of problems he would have to deal with. Without proper protection, the cold was lethal at night, and the animals were hungry and desperate. But with no one else willing to join him, Kevin felt he had no choice. He packed some essentials and started plotting a route towards the crash site. Preparation takes time. It was going to be a few days' journey at least. Despite looking small on the map, Alaskan boreal forests are actually pretty huge areas of wild land, and going into them requires a lot of respect for the elements of nature. Kevin made up his mind and began preparing for the expedition after a few days without news about the cause of the explosion. But he knew he'd have to go deeper into the forest than he'd ever gone before to find what he was looking for. Kevin decided to take a trip, one that would last for a whole week, in order to investigate the source of the loud noise. He gathered his belongings and set out on his journey the following morning to start towards the crash site. It was a harsh journey. After being out in the cold by himself for a few days, Kevin was completely spent. He had started having second thoughts about his choice and was considering going back. The cold was unbearable, especially at night when the brisk air chilled his bones. Not only did the cold keep him awake at night, but so did the noises he heard every night. Wolves howling, sniffing around his tent, birds flying and croaking. It all felt hostile and hopeless. However, he decided to continue on. Kevin didn't realize it at the time, but he was about to be rewarded for the risk he was taking. Something good happened to Kevin on the fourth day of his journey. After all, he had discovered the first hints, which was critical because it would now be much easier to determine what was causing the noise. He stepped on random metal parts scattered throughout the forest, some of which were even hanging from the trees. When he saw the fragments for the first time, he knew he was on the right track. It gave him a second wind. Kevin could tell that these metal parts hadn't been here for long because there was no greenery growing on them. Kevin was extremely fortunate to discover them at that time, as these parts would most likely be buried in the snow in a few days. But Kevin knew that he was still a ways off from the rocket. However, he was already finding fragments of it all around him. How big was this thing? He thought. He would find out, but for now, all he had was this first clue. Kevin examined them carefully but was unable to identify any of them. All he could tell was that they appeared to be expensive, despite the fact that they appeared to be heavily damaged. The metal was some sort of aluminum alloy, like the kind on planes. He got even more curious. There was no insignia, no markers, nothing that could denote ownership on the fragments that he's found. He wondered what country could afford to just lose a rocket like this. USA? Russia? India? Pushing these thoughts away, he decided to continue on. While walking, he discovered more and more metal parts scattered about. He knew he was getting closer to the evidence he had been looking for all these days. Kevin kept following the trail of debris. As he walked, something caught his eye behind the trees, a glint. What was it? He scrambled towards the peculiar sight, which was getting hard to see as the sun reflected off it. As he went after the light, he noticed it getting bigger and bigger, and suddenly he stood under one of the most impressive things he's ever seen in his life. When Kevin left, he felt as if this was what he had been looking for since the beginning of an adventure, his expedition into the forest. But at the moment, he felt like he was making a big mistake. Even as he got closer, it was difficult to tell what he was seeing. All he knew for sure was that it was enormous. He had to go get a closer look, but he had to pass through a grove of trees to get to the actual crash site. He noted the smell of sulfur and char in the air. The rocket had started a fire when it landed. He pushed through the dead trees. He finally saw it in all its glory after making his way through the final rows of trees. A massive space rocket had fallen from the sky. He hadn't expected to find anything like this, but he was both proud of himself and surprised. When he finally confirmed what it was, Kevin was elated. Not even in his wildest dreams did he expect to find a freaking rocket in the middle of nowhere. Granted, it was busted up and will probably never fly again, but still. He allowed himself a moment to sit down and look at his discovery. It was a huge rocket, just like the one SpaceX used. It had a huge white chassis with burn marks all over it, marks of re-entry into the atmosphere. Well, now he's found it. What will Kevin do next? As he sat down next to his find, he lit a cigarette and determined his next steps. It took quite a trek to get here on foot, and he was going to take his time and be smart about this. Kevin was eager to investigate the rocket, but he had no idea how dangerous it could be for him. After some consideration, he decided that it was fine to take a closer look at the spaceship because nothing had happened to it after it had crashed down to Earth. It was a big risk to try and explore the rocket on his own. Kevin knew that he wasn't a scientist. Hell, he was still taking his mechanics course at the community college. But he knew enough to get by, he thought. The rocket had been here for nearly a week, and if this thing was going to explode or something for whatever reason, he figured it would have happened by now. It was a risk Kevin was willing to take, but was it one he would come to regret? Kevin began to walk around the spaceship a few times. The strangest thing he noticed was that the spaceship was not as badly damaged as he had anticipated. It still looked like a spaceship, for one. It had most likely crashed in the forest, but the majority of it was in good condition. How could that be, in fact, too good like it landed quite softly, despite burning down a good portion of the forest on the way down? Even an average Joe like Kevin could figure out that the rocket ship got off easy. It still looked like it did in all those pictures he's seen, right down to the windows and the doors. However, this one had no NASA insignia. Kevin speculated that the treetops may have cushioned the fall slightly, or that the rocket was made of such strong materials that it could withstand such an impact. Then there was another question that kept popping into Kevin's head. Kevin wondered if anyone else was aware of the rocket's presence in the forest. Someone had to have known, right? This thing had to be worth millions of dollars and had just arrived here. Of course, his town knew, but who else? People had to be on the lookout for it. People should have discovered it by now. Who loses a freaking rocket ship? But why didn't they report it to the authorities? How is it that it's still relatively untouched 5 days later? Kevin decided to look for more markings. Maybe he didn't see them the first time. He looked for hints as to who it might belong to on the rocket's exterior. He looked for country flags or company logos, but couldn't find anything. That was weirder than finding a rocket ship in the forest, a spacefaring vehicle with no identifying marks. After considering why this could be the case, he believes he has discovered the answer. There appear to be burn marks on parts of the rocket ship. This rocket had to have been in space, and the heat of re-entering the Earth's atmosphere could have burned off everything on its exterior. But that doesn't explain everything. After all, he's seen pictures and videos of the space shuttle landing, and it wasn't nearly this bad. You could still clearly see the insignia and markings on a NASA space shuttle when it came back to Earth. What on earth was this thing doing here? This crash on land appeared to be extremely dangerous. That couldn't be the plan, could it? Is it possible that something went wrong? And that's when a strange feeling began to creep up on Kevin. Kevin knew that the space shuttle program was designed to ferry more people around space. So it stands to reason that this would have passengers in it. After all, the whole rocket ship looked roomy enough to fit a bus. Is it possible that someone was still inside, that they were sent on a space mission, but due to a malfunction or something, they crashed? Kevin needed to figure this out, and there was only one way he could do so. Kevin was so taken aback he had to light another cigarette. He's unsure of what to do next. It's not like they trained you how to react to rocket ships crashing in your local forest back in high school. He takes a drag and reassesses the situation. He knew that the only way he'd get these answers was if he managed to get into the rocket ship. This was much easier said than done because he didn't see a clear way to do it. He looked for doors, windows, hatches, anything that can be used to climb through. But there seemed to be nothing. Even after impact with the ground, the rocket remained tightly sealed. But after closely inspecting the machine, Kevin thought he might have found the weak point he could exploit, but it wasn't in the place he expected. He went closer to a small area of the rocket, near the middle of the structure. A small door near the back of the rocket was still closed, but part of it had bent open. There it was, an opening. He could get inside. It wasn't a huge door, and it was only ever so slightly ajar, but it's big enough for Kevin to put something in there to create leverage and break it open even more. So he started looking for a way to get this done. A crowbar would be ideal for this, but Kevin doesn't have one in his backpack at the moment. It's not like he expected to break into a rocket ship when he packed for the trip. He'll have to get creative, but luckily he already has a plan in place. But that idea was fraught with danger, and Kevin had already taken action on it. He looked around. Plenty of debris was strewn all around him. There is still a lot of wreckage from the crash, so perhaps there was something he could use. Kevin must find a piece that is both long and strong enough to withstand extreme pressure. He figured a long steel pipe would probably do the trick. He started going around once more, this time looking at the ground, searching for the perfect piece of metal. And it didn't take long for him to get it. And there was a long steel pipe. It looked like it came from the shuttle, from somewhere inside the engine. The long steel pipe fits almost perfectly in the bent open section of the hole. Kevin got into position and began putting as much weight as he could on the end of the pipe, and bang, he finally had a way into the rocket. The door was forced open after the lock on it became dislodged. Kevin took a hard fall, but he didn't seem to notice the pain. The adrenaline from the discovery was pumping at an alarming rate, and he couldn't stop it. Curiosity was getting the better of him. It had gotten to the point where the only thing that mattered to him was whether or not that rocket ship held any secrets. This was the point at which Kevin began to feel nervous. He was only an hour ago looking for something unusual in the forest, and now he was about to enter a crashed rocket. He carefully made his way through the small doorpost into a similarly small shaft that appeared to lead to the top of the rocket ship. This was not going to be an easy task. How was he going to get inside the rocket without falling? Kevin struggled a lot to get through the shaft. It was probably more spacious in the rocket's original design, but it was completely squished by the impact. The occasional sharp point protruding from the wall made the crawl even more difficult. Kevin did, however, eventually make it to the end of the shaft. While crawling, he began to have second thoughts as well. What if this piece of junk catches fire or something? He had no idea what was going on inside. He knew all the answers he needed were behind the door at the end of the shaft, so he decided to go deeper inside the rocket. Fortunately, this door was not locked. Nobody expected anyone to make it through the first door. Kevin squeezed his way through the small hole and into a larger room. This was exactly what he was looking for. There was what appeared to be a control center. It was much smaller than he had imagined a rocket ship to be. There was also no seating. Is it true that someone was launched into space in this? And if that's the case, how did the astronauts survive in this rocket? Kevin became increasingly interested in everything. He began to look around, and he began to wonder how this rocket had gotten into space. He was certain that no human had been present when it was launched, assuming it was launched at all. He also discovered some information about the rocket. It appeared to have been launched by the United States, as he discovered their flag in several locations. But he had also discovered the rocket's name. Kevin knew this was his chance to find out who was in this rocket. Kevin quickly grabbed his phone but discovered that there was no signal anywhere. The walls of this rocket must be resistant to phone frequencies. Kevin had to leave the rocket to check his phone. But how could he remember what he discovered in the plane? He took a quick look around before grabbing the plate with the name and model number from the control center. This way he wouldn't forget it and would have something to remember this crazy day by. He then exited the rocket to check his phone. He needed to look this up now, so he quickly Googled the rocket's model. The information took a long time to load because Kevin was still in the middle of an Alaskan forest. The images began to load gradually. The images that eventually loaded showed the rocket that Kevin had stood inside. And it appears that this was a common rocket, but it served a purpose that explained everything to Kevin. He was astounded to learn what the rocket was used for. Apparently, this rocket was used to transport satellites to space rather than people. Except for perfecting the settings, there was never supposed to be anyone in this thing. Kevin couldn't believe what he was reading. However, he read even stranger things. According to what he was reading online, these rockets frequently crashed into the sea and were designed to cause as little damage as possible. Of course, if one landed on land, the results would be very different. On his way back to town, Kevin called the local government to report his discovery and the precise location of it. They promised to get this information to the appropriate person and thanked Kevin for his assistance. Kevin wondered if he'd ever hear anything else about the rocket from the authorities. A representative from the actual U.S. government called Kevin a few days later to ask if he had been in the rocket. Kevin considered it, but ultimately decided to be truthful. He received an unexpected response. This was thankfully appreciated and was not a big deal unless he severely damaged the rocket. Of course, this was not the case, and as a reward for finding the rocket, Kevin received a decent financial reward.